Sé Susan Cameron an tanna mahors fás mi dunne Cameronach. Sé Susan Kinnan a bhunam.
Okay. Agus Colaisde how?
Ha mi Antigonish. Sa bhela bhór.
How fuair chi seo fat na húne?
Ha? Ja, ruchach mi agus hogach mi an seo. Agus fá mi ar fálah anja lissom bliana nó dá bliana.
Agus well, is like a chase swanne go hacket.
Well, I'll speak in English for this. I never did practice my Sláinte. I understand how it all works, but
very good.
I know a lot more about my father's side of the family. He was a lot more interested in the genealogy side of things than my mother was. My father was a McKinnon, and so on his side of the family, his mother was a Chisholm. So both the McKinnon and the Chisholm sides, I can go all the way back to Scotland in terms of the genealogy. So, and my father actually took me to see, which I find this really interesting, took me to see a grave in St. Andrews, Marydale area, in Antigonish County, where the first Chisholm who came from his side of the family was buried, and his wife. So they both lived into their, he was Archibald Chisholm and she was Isabel, I believe, and they lived into their 90s. So, and it had on the gravestone, you know, that they were from Strathclass and Scotland. So, so I saw that with my own eyes.
Great. Yeah. So what was the pioneer's name again?
I believe it was Archibald. It's been a little while since I looked at any of this, I think. And unfortunately, I went back maybe, I don't know, 5-6 years ago to look for the gravestone. And I think they're under the ground now. But I know that it existed because some of it's been published online of the names of the graves that were there.
Right.
So I know I wasn't making this up. So I was glad to see that was verified online. With the names that were there. So I think just over time. So it would have been, you know, between 25 and 30 years ago when I had seen that originally. So, yeah. Some of the other names I know connected with my father's family are Macintosh and Affleck, which was kind of an interesting name. I believe it's Welsh. So on my mother's side, she was a Campbell. And some of the other names on her side were, her mother was a White. So we're not sure, but it may have had an Acadian background there, but she certainly wasn't brought up with any kind of Acadian roots. But some of the genealogy looks like they must have come from perhaps the Shetty Camp area. And then there was also Carroll and Livingston. So that's about it in terms of the any kind of names that I know in the background.
Right. So your mother's maiden name
was Campbell.
Campbell.
Yeah.
And do you know what part her people came
from? You know what? I really don't know. She said, I think what the story I do know is that certainly her grandfather came from outside of the Sydney area. So my mother was from what they call Victoria Mines today.
Okay.
So he came from. She just knew it was a rural area of Cape Breton, and he came there to. There were coal mines, I think, in South Barr area.
Right.
So he was the train engineer. So he came from somewhere in. She said she thought it started with B, so I don't know. It could be Gléidheadh, it could be Boysdale, right? There were Campbells definitely in Boysdale. Or Bullardry. So I did look in the historical vital statistics, the Nova Scotia site, and it says that he was born in Gléidheadh, but I don't know if that would just mean that that's where they registered the birth or what it might mean.
Right.
So she just didn't seem to have that much interest in that. So that's a lot of that I found out on my own. Yeah.
So just for the people that don't speak Gaelic, I asked you your name and where you're from. So can you just say that in English for?
Yeah. Well, I'm Susan Cameron. I'm actually was Susan McKinnon. I'm married to a Cameron. And I'm from Antigonish. I was born and raised here. I was born in the town. I live outside of the town in the Fairmont area now. But I've stayed here most of my life, other than when I was away in short periods of time for education. I went to London, Ontario, and I spent a summer in Calgary and, a few short trips here and there. But most of my life, yes, I've lived here, and I have been working here for quite a while at this point. Yeah.
I understand you took a leave at one point and went to Scotland?
Oh, yes. I had
that for a whole year or part of a year?
I was on sabbatical for a year, which would have been July 2010 to the end of June 2011. So I did go to Scotland twice in that period. The first time I went over in August, and I went to a conference. It was a Gaelic conference in Aberdeen at Aberdeen University, and from there I went to Salmore Ostig, where I sat in on the autumn term of Colaisde. So while I was there, I actually got to do quite a lot. There was a reading week, so I spent that reading week in Edinburgh. And at Salmore Ostig itself, we got to do quite a few field trips around the Isle of Skye, and I made friends with a woman called MacDonald, and she was from the Inverness area, so and her father was living there, so he knew a lot about the Strathclass area. So he was actually he took us on a nice trip up there, and we saw the Chisholm Stone, and without my befriending them, I wouldn't have had an opportunity at all. So that was quite a highlight.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah. And then on the second, and then I went back in June. So I came home in mid-December and went back again in June for 3 weeks. And at that point, we went back to Strathclass. I was back to Skye, but I went to Gléidheadh that time, which is this where I think I didn't say this before, but on the McKinnon side, they came from Gléidheadh, and the Chisholm side, it was the Strathclass area. So I actually got to see both those areas. So that was. And
did you see this MacDonald person that you befriended?
Yes, I saw her.
The second trip.
Yes, yeah. So again, we went on another little trip to the Strathclass area. So we saw an old graveyard with lots of Chisholms in it. But we saw something really interesting while we were there, which was there's a church there called Marydale, which I found very interesting because the Chisholm ancestors of mine settled in the Marydale area of Antigonish County. So I thought there had to be a connection there with the name. And as Morag and I were going towards the church, there was this old stone that was outside the church, and it had some Gaelic written on it. It was Gléidheadh, I think so. It was like an old, very ancient baptismal stone that would have been used in that area. And I think it was moved when they made that church. They put it there, but I don't know if it was originally there. So that was a really fascinating find to see that there. I have a little bit of I have pictures of it, and I have some more information about that. But that was kind of like she didn't know it was there. I didn't know it was there. We were wandering around, so we kind of had. Yeah, so that was one of the highlights. Right. While I was there, I also because it was part of a sabbatical year, I had some good interviews with people that were working on Topra and Dulcish. So Margaret MacDonald was the project manager, so I had a good interview with her. And
another MacDonald.
Yeah, yes, yeah, and she was a really, really competent, lovely woman. So I have a nice audio interview of her. So, and she went into detail about just how extensive the planning and how big that project is and how many people work on it, and all the technical parts. So it was that was interesting. The same with the Carmichael Watson project, and at the University of Edinburgh, I went to the library there, and went to the National Library of Scotland, and there was a Catholic, Scottish Catholic Archives in Edinburgh. It's closed since, but I spent some time in that archive as well. So yeah, I packed it all in a short time.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Did that close recently?
Yeah, there was a controversy a few years ago now. I believe it's since closed. It's moved out of Edinburgh. I don't know if they've sort of been able to consolidate it in another spot or not, but the person who was in there, I dealt with a couple of different people while I was in there.
Must have been a bounty of material.
Oh, it was some really interesting stuff. And another kind of interesting story there was, I think I was getting ready to leave, and I just forget the name now. It's a little while ago of the person I was dealing with, but he said, there's an old box of books downstairs in the basement, and maybe I'll take them up and you can have a little look. And I was shocked to find there was a copy of Antigonish, which is a famous little Gaelic book that was, famous in as it was the first Gaelic book published in North America. Well, actually, I think we found out since then there was something published earlier in North Carolina, but for a long time we thought it was the first published Gaelic book, and it was put together by a McGillivray man, and so it's the Youth's Companion is the English translation. So the copy that we have here said it was a very rare book, that there weren't very many, and it was published I think I have the date right, 1836. So he had a copy of that book, just in a book in a box that was in their basement.
What a coincidence that you picked that book.
Yeah, so I was plus I really do think it's a pretty rare book, but to be published in this area of the world in 1836, it would have been great to know the provenance of that copy there, but he didn't know a lot. So anyway, I know there was at least one more around than I had known before that. So
this is great.
Yeah.
And then comes the Gaelic Agus L. Kemada Hulu Elwas said a Gaelic.
Well,
how did you get introduced to Gaelic?
I've thought about that a lot because the question comes up, and I certainly didn't grow up in a Gaelic-speaking family. However, my father was very interested in Scotland and Scotland history, and he took certainly he was in England during the war, so he certainly had been to Scotland on numerous trips, and I do remember a few things. I know he sent postcards home where he would talk about particularly being in Skye and running into little girls who sang Gaelic songs. So I think I know there was such a thing as a language. Growing up in Antigonish town, I don't remember hearing it at all. No. But I do, unless it was the only other kinds of memories that I might have is that my father was a very good friend of Mother St. Veronica, who was the sister of Angus L. MacDonald. Right. She was a history professor here at St. X. And she would have taught him Scottish history while he was a student here, and they were very good friends. And my youngest sister, who's just below me in age, her name is Sheena, and it's spelled in the Gaelic way. So I know that Mother St. Veronica was involved in choosing that name for my sister Sheena. So at some point, whenever I was old enough to know what her name was and how it was spelled, I didn't know that it was a Gaelic name. It was spelled in the Gaelic, in the Gaelic way. It's Sine, and there's an accent on the I. Yeah. So, other than that, I do remember as a small child being out at Tando MacIsaac's farm. He was a good friend of my father. I know his wife spoke Gaelic, and I'm not sure if he did or not, but there's certainly Gaelic tradition within those MacIsaac's from Giants Lake. So perhaps when I was a child visiting there, I might have heard it, but certainly was not anything that I was frequently exposed to growing up, unfortunately. Yeah.
But can you tell me, was there maybe one person or someone that might have inspired you along the way, that maybe you took some classes?
Well, when I as I said, I knew of its existence, and growing up in Antigonish, it would be hard pressed not to know that that the people around here had Scottish surnames, and that the schools were named Braymore, and all the streets around us had Highland names. So I think it would have been impossible and there was Highland games and pipers and fiddlers around. So it would have been impossible not to know about the Scottish end of things. So my knowledge of the language, I think by the time I was coming to St. X for my first degree, I had really kind of had an interest at that point, and I thought about taking Gaelic as an elective, but I just wasn't able to fit it into the schedule that I had. So what happened was, after I began working here in 1986, within a couple of years, I started to sit in on the Celtic courses here. So my first actual formal Gaelic class was, I think it was 1990 or 1991, with Ken Nelson, who taught here. So at that point, I was like telling the story. Mary Jane Lamond was in the first class with us. So yeah, when I looked at her progress versus mine, I always thought, yeah, we started at the same time, but how that goes. I had a few things going on, I think, to get in the way that halted my progress. But yeah, so other than that,
well, she might have had a different background too.
Yeah, and she had the attitude. She had the proper attitude right off the bat. I can remember having a little chat with her because I had known her a little bit, and saying, "Oh, I'm taking this class too." And I said, I'm really interested in it and it might be fun. And I was saying things like that, right? And she was saying, "Well, I intend to speak it." And I thought that memory came back to me, and I thought she actually had the right attitude.
The intention.
Yeah, she actually had the right attitude, and I wish I had probably, told myself that was my intention at the time. Might have made a difference, but I sometimes think of that. And from that point forward, I just started to get involved in anything and everything that was offered, in terms of formal classes here. And in those days, St. X did a lot of things, like there was a Gaelic day, there was a few immersion experiences, like weekend immersion experiences. So I would just go to anything that I could along those lines. Yeah. In terms of one person, I'd have to say, I had Goody or Jeff MacDonald for a teacher quite a lot, Seamus Watson for a teacher quite a lot, and Ken Nelson. So I'd say those three people in terms of people who taught me would come to my mind. Yeah, I would say those three are people that I probably, apart from what I did when I was in Scotland, because we were different teachers there, obviously. But I think those three people are probably, in terms of actual classes kind of situations, I probably learned a lot from them. And I mean, I'd include John Shaw in terms of, the Scotia Sabbatical experiences in terms of teaching me as well. So,
right.
Yeah.
And that takes place at the Highland Village, or
yes.
the Bell and the Gale.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Every summer, I believe.
It has been. We didn't have it last summer, but we're hoping to have it again this summer. It had gone in, I'd say maybe 9 years or something like that, without a break, and we intend to continue.
Okay, I'd love to ask you now, Susan, about your family connections to Gaelic again. Can you tell me if there was any family members that spoke Gaelic or played any instruments or were involved with the music in any way or singing?
Well, unfortunately, there's been no music that I can think of in terms of my family. Certainly not in the last, not as far back as my grandparents. Perhaps some of their siblings, I really don't know. Didn't come from a musical family at all. But in terms of Gaelic, there's a couple of things that I did start to ask because I was curious. I never knew my grandfather, McKinnon. He was dead long before I was born. But I know that his mother was Janet Boyd, who was a half-sister to John Boyd, who was the publisher of the casket, which had begun in Gaelic. So I'm kind of assuming from that Janet Boyd, my great-grandmother, must have known Gaelic. Now, whether or not she taught it to my grandfather, I haven't been able to find out. My father's passed away now. So I'm thinking probably not. But my grandmother's father, his name was Sir Joseph Chisholm, and I did ask my uncle. I was curious again because at the time period he grew up in Marydale in Antigonish County. There would have been Gaelic around, no question. He was a Chisholm, so he certainly came from that background. So I did ask my uncle about it. Did his grandfather have Gaelic? And he said he doesn't remember him speaking it to him, but when my grandfather was quite elderly and in the hospital in Halifax, because that's where he lived, my uncle remembers being in the room with him, and some older man had come all the way from Marydale to visit him in the hospital, and he said they spoke in Gaelic the whole time. My uncle didn't have any Gaelic at all, but he says he remembers distinctly the phrase "shenakada" at the end of it. So so that's stretching it, but that's really all I can dredge up in terms of a direct kind of Gaelic.
The casket being published in Gaelic at the beginning, and it was John Boyd, the name of the fellow.
Yes, yeah, the printer. Sometimes he was referred to as so. Yeah. So I was proud of that little Gaelic pedigree.
Right.
That connection.
That's good. And but the casket, just for people to know, it was a weekly newspaper.
It's still ongoing. Yes. It began in 1852.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great to know those dates. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask you about your educational background, Susan. Where did you attend school and university?
All right. Well, I was thinking about this not long ago. Braemore Elementary School was opened, shortly before I began grade primary there. So that was one brand new school I went to. And then the Antigonish Regional High School, it was called in those days. It's now called the Dr. John Hugh Gillis Regional High School. That opened up just like a year or two before I was ready to go to grade 7 there. So they were side by side, and they were about 5 minutes from my home. So I walked that way to school for 13 years, 2 brand new schools. So, and from there I went to St. X, where I did an arts degree in, I majored in history and minored in English. Right. And after that I did an education degree. So I graduated in 81 with my BA, and 82 was my Bachelor of Education degree. And that was in secondary social studies. So and then oh, sorry, I'm not finished my education.
Go ahead. Yeah.
And then I taught for a year and some substituting, and then I decided I would do my library degree. So, pardon me, I went to University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario for my Master's of Library and Information Science, it was called at the time, yeah. In
Okay,
86.
and then you came back here?
Yeah, so I came back here and I worked, there was a maternity leave at, it was called CBU, with UCCB at those times, so Cape Breton University.
In Sydney?
In Sydney, so I was there for a 6-month maternity leave. And then I came back and was fortunate enough to get part-time work here at the St. X, or the Angus L MacDonald Library. From 86, I was part-time a year or two, and then I've been working here full-time ever since.
So your current job here at the library is in the special collections room.
That's right.
And
I am.
Can you tell us a bit about this room and the people connected to it?
So I did various positions in the library up until it was December 2005, so basically 2006, when Maureen Lonergan Williams had retired from being there looking after this room. So I was fortunate enough to get the position here at that time, which you know, it's not very often you get to sort of marry your interests with your job in the way that it came together so nicely for me. Yeah. I had been, you know, involved in the Gaelic world and learning Gaelic and doing community things for so long, so that when this opportunity came, I was quite happy to get it. So it was a steep learning curve. Maureen was really, really knowledgeable in the subject area, because she has a double master's in Celtic Studies. I didn't have any formal Celtic Studies degree, other than I had taken I'd sat in on or audited all of the courses here in the Celtic Studies department, but I had the librarian training, so that was helpful in terms of how this room operates. And then, you know, I learned a lot quite quickly, just by dealing with the students and the faculty, and you know, along with the interests that I had before that. So
other people in the background of this place, when it was first built, I guess, the library, was Sister St. Veronica here at that time, and did she have something to do with the creation of this special collections room? Right.
Well, Sister St. Veronica, I don't know of her direct involvement. What I do know is that, going back to Monsignor Patrick Nicholson, and I believe that the dates are like 1929 or 30 or something like that, he put a notice in the casket, we had spoken about the casket earlier, saying that if anybody had had Gaelic materials or books, and that he thought that St. X should have a Gaelic library, is how he called it at the time. So he kind of put out a notice to people way back, and you know, as I think it was 29 or 30 thereabouts. So fast forward, I think they were starting to get a bit of a collection together in the old libraries. The Angus L MacDonald Library was opened in 1965. That's where we're sitting here today. Angus L MacDonald himself was actually supposed to be the first chair of the Celtic department here at St. X, but he sadly passed away. But
he was Premier of Nova Scotia.
He was Premier of Nova Scotia. So in the planning of the library, he had apparently, it was his vision to have the hall of clans that we see outside, plus these 2 rooms set aside for a Gaelic library. So that was really the genesis of it. After that, you know, there were a lot of people that contributed works. Father Brewer was the university librarian shortly after this library opened, and he was very supportive. Maureen Williams she wasn't the first curator. It was I'm just forgetting her name now, Sister Jean, forget her last name, sorry, who was here for quite a few years right at the beginning. Sister Margaret MacDonald would have been, you know, around and instrumental in making connections with people in Scotland, most notably John Lorne Campbell and his wife Margaret Fay Shaw, because they, you know, they were like heavily involved in putting us in touch with people in Scotland who had materials that we might purchase. John Lorne himself donated books, money, and as I say, he was involved in making us aware of not me personally, but we as in the library, aware of resources. So there's a long list of people that you know, really, that we have to be thankful to for the fact that this place exists. And it is an impressive collection, and people do, you know, I get emails or people come here and research trips to look at some materials that aren't necessarily in Scotland, some of them. So it's certainly been compared with the collection at Harvard, so we're quite fortunate to have that here.
And there's some rare books here as well.
Yes, there's a rare book room separate from this, but we have some rare and valuable books here, no question. One of the interesting things we have, for example, for primary material that you wouldn't find outside of Scotland would be, we actually have the questionnaires that John Moran Campbell sent around to the parishes, and the both Protestant and Catholic parishes questionnaires about how much Gaelic was in around Nova Scotia. I believe the date's 1931, so we actually have those original questionnaires. So we have some unique material like that, as well as the what we call the Ridge manuscripts. Right. So these are certainly treasures that you won't find anywhere else. So yeah. So Bishop Fraser was the first bishop of Antigonish, and he came from Scotland. And there's Gaelic folklore. He features prominently in some Gaelic folklore stories that have been told around here, because he was apparently a big, strong man, very good at horseback riding. You'd have to picture what the area was like in the time that he was here, so he would have had to say Mass, he would have gone on horseback. And there's stories that feature in Beach Hill in Antigonish, just outside of Antigonish here, where he's supposed to have met the devil, and he was on his horse. So there's a little story around that. Wow. There's a story about just how strong he was, how good he was at hunting. In fact, you don't have your camera on it, but we have his rifle in here as an artifact. So that's very interesting. Of course, Bishop McKinnon was instrumental in founding St. X. So,
any relation to?
Well, I think he was from Ag as well, so I do think there is a distant relation. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. One thing I forgot to mention was, it kind of fits in here, we're talking about Sister St. Veronica. I mentioned earlier that she was a friend of my father, but another way I may have heard Gaelic was that my father was, Bill McKinnon, was a CJFX broadcaster, and a lot of people were familiar with him at the time, because, the CJFX was all over Cape Breton as well. And he did some radio programs with Sister St. Veronica for the Gaelic choir, that St. X Gaelic choir, because she was the director of the St. X Gaelic choir. Right. So I'm thinking, as a child, I must have heard, he must have been talking about that when he was working on it. Might have had the recordings at home or heard them on the radio. So I think that was another, place where I might have been exposed to Gaelic. So, yeah. And we have, St. X has digitized those recordings. So I've heard them, I've heard them in the last few years. So there's some nice Gaelic singing in it, and she's doing some speaking too. So
great to have those.
Yeah,
excellent resources.
Yeah.
So we'll turn now to your work in the community, Susan. Right. I know you've been a member of the Gaelic Council, Nova Scotia, and you were on the board of the Highland Village, Ballin and Gale, they call it now. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and what work you did, and what you accomplished?
All right. Well, I'll try to do this in chronological order, just so I'll remember myself. I think the first organization I was involved with was the Antigonish Highland Society. So I was the secretary of that, a member, and then the secretary for a few years. Mm-hmm. After that, the next organization I think I got involved with the Gaelic Council. So I was on that board, and I was the secretary for a little while on that one as well. The next official organization that I was involved with on the board was the Ballin and Gale, was the Highland Village at that time. Mm-hmm. So I was on that board for 6 years, and I filled the roles of treasurer, and then I was the chair of the board at the end of, I guess it was a year or two at the end of my 6-year term. So those were the formal organizations. Oh yes, and the Antigonish Gaelic Society had a little group there, and I was involved in when that started, and so I was on that board for a little while as well. Mm-hmm. So those are the official kinds of boards I was on. But in addition to that, I've done some things, like I did some workshops for the staff at the Highland Village in terms of Gaelic resources. I was on the steering committee for the Gléidheadh website, and I was involved in Barr. Yes. So I was one of them. That's a mentorship program that the Office of Gaelic Affairs puts on. So
and it means root and branch.
That's right. Yeah. So that was just forgetting the exact year. It's a few years ago now. So that was a program that was designed on a way of transmitting language sort of from just in a natural setting in a home or wherever you might be. So Leanne Hinton, who's quite well known with working with Indigenous languages in the United States, came here and did a presentation when we got started with that program. She was very impressive. So she gave us some materials to work with and some ideas and some kind of showed us how it might work, how it was working for the Indigenous people. So I was paired up with Joe McKinnon, who we both live in. He lives outside of Antigonish here. So he's a lovely man to work with, no question. Everybody that meets Joe has the same opinion of him, I'm sure. So what we would do is I would visit Joe in his home, and we did different things. Sometimes we'd just talk about, what were you doing this week, and Shenachas, just little sayings and things like that. Sometimes we listened to some of the recordings on Gail Stream, and then we would stop the tape and talk about what we try to tell the story over. Or he would ask questions, and we would do things like that. He has a bit of a farm, so we would be outside and we'd look at the garden or the animals or any kind of activities like that. We'd have, of course, we always had a little stoop back, and we'd have something to eat and drink. And the program was designed to I think there were X number of hours you were supposed to fit in over the year. Mm-hmm. It was challenging to fit in those number of hours. So I really did benefit from it. I could tell at the time, but like other things you do when you get away from it, it's like I wished now that I had taken more advantage of it in terms of putting in more hours, but it just got difficult to find the time when you're working. But it was a wonderful program, and I basically when I think back to it, one of the best experiences for me was that he was absolutely easy for me to speak with. I had no hesitation. I'm sure that I can. Oh, the other things we did was we drove to Cape Breton to meet with some of the other members, mentors and speakers. So I remember one trip we went to Cape Breton. So what was really great was in the car driving down there, we would speak the whole time in Gaelic, and I had never had that kind of sustained opportunity to speak and was comfortable enough to do it. So to me, if the two people working together are a good match, really good things can come out of it that way.
Hey, yeah. Susan, I'd like to ask you now, what sort of changes have you seen in Gaelic over the years since you've become involved? You told me you started getting involved in Gaelic around 1990, so it's about 26 years, a little more. Yep. What changes have you noticed? There
have been quite a lot of changes. I think if a lot of my direct experiences here at St. Yves, so I can think back to when the first class I sat in was probably 89, 90, and there were a lot of students taking Celtic Celtic studies courses in those days, particularly some of there was a Celtic literature course, and even the Gaelic 100. They were fairly large classes. These things tend to go a bit in cycles, but certainly way back then it was a heyday in terms of students being interested in particularly the activities around it. Like there would always be there were a lot of social events, there were a lot of music, there was a lot of music played. The Student Celtic Society was very, very active in those days. So I saw that sort of fluctuate over the last 25 years to the point where there's fewer people working in the Celtic department here now, and there are fewer students. So that's been a bit of a, quite a noticeable change from that aspect of Gaelic. During that time, also there were a few years where Irish Gaelic was being taught here because it was supported by the Irish government. Irish and Canadian government would sponsor teachers to come here, so that kind of added a dimension of another Gaelic language being taught here. Now, also when I way back when I first started, St. Yves had a lot of Gaelic days, so in those days native speakers would come to it because there really weren't a lot of different things going on way back then. So, you'd had a couple of Gaelic days at St. X, and people came, a lot of people from Cape Breton came up, and a lot of native Gaelic speakers participated in those days, and there would be a social event in the evening. So there was a lot of fun in those days, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for the language. And there were a number of people over the years who have gone on to, continue to be involved in Gaelic, and so that was kind of the beginning of it. What I see today is a lot more community kind of based classes. So when I started, there would have been, other than these Gaelic days, nothing else really to go to in the evening. And then, when the Office of Gaelic Affairs started, there were these community classes that began. So at that stage, there were teachers teaching every mostly during the fall and the winter of the year, but we had weekly classes with different teachers. And there was a lot of, in the early days, we used to go from house to house, and it was a good gathering of people, and we developed a nice community. And this lasted a number of years, but that has kind of fallen away a little bit. Now, myself, I was because I was interim university librarian for the previous 2 years to coming back into the collection now. I was a little bit out of touch with what was going on in the community, but since I've been back here, again, I've been starting to go out again and hearing people hearing and people talk about what things are involved in. So I see some positive things, and I see some changes that in terms of the sheer numbers are not the same in the institutional setting that they were. On the other hand, the community groups seem to be, there's some good gatherings that are happening there. I know of the initiatives that were done last year where they had the Gaelic immersion with the house in, was it Aberdeen or New Aberdeen or wherever they got together.
Yes.
Yeah. So, that sounded really promising, and certainly there was nothing like that 25 years ago. So it's interesting how you see some parts are strengthened, and sometimes it's just change. It's hard to say whether it's a strengthening or not.
Can you comment at all on the Gaelic in the school system?
Well, that's another thing that came, in the 25 years. Brian MacDonald was one of the names that you'd have to single out there, because he was very tirelessly working towards getting Gaelic to be taught in schools in Antigonish County, to the point where, now it's been, I don't know, I'm going to guess 10 years, maybe more.
How many schools?
And it was in like some of the elementary schools, the feeder schools, and then the junior schools, and all the way up to the high schools. So I'm going to guess it's in at least 3 now. And there've been different teachers that come here over that time too. So that's a big change. But I have to say, what we're not seeing is an awful lot of students who are then ending up here at Celtic Studies at St. X, considering as a result of how many of them would be exposed to Gaelic in the schools. Now, that's not to say there have been none, because obviously there's some. And in any, say you're always only going to get a handful of students who end up majoring in the Celtic Studies and taking the language part of it very seriously. But the bigger numbers you start out with, then the chances are the percentages, you get more numbers. So I see that as a little bit of a disappointing change. Again, with what my direct experience is, connected to the fact that this is where I work and it's what I see. But on the other hand, programs like Barr certainly weren't around in those days, and I find that it's a good direction that's going. There's been a recent meeting where at the Gaelic College where Barr and Stores of Ella as programs were discussed, and some ideas came out of that 2-day meeting. So we'll see what the next steps are, but certainly community-based education is an enriching experience for language.
Attend that meeting?
Yes, I did attend the meeting. So yeah. I don't know. I think there's not a one-size-fits-all solution here. So I think the more you see going on, the better. It's hard to say what kind of an event will attract a new person to come in here. So I think the more things that are going on, and there's a lot of work going on in the Gaelic Committee. It's clear when you come to a meeting like that one I was at last weekend. It's very clear that a lot of people have their heart in the right places, and they're very committed. Now to translate that into the results that people really want to see is where the tricky part comes, obviously, you know. I also think there's one other thing has changed in the years going back to 1990 to now is obviously the extent of the internet and online learning and, you know, lessons over Skype and all of the technological changes have just made the material so much more easily accessible. So that should have a positive effect. You know, I think when I began, you know, like it's not that you didn't have a way to record things, but it was so cumbersome. You know, really, I think now if I had a nice recorder when I was sitting in the Gaelic classes here and actually recorded the classes and then listened to them later, would have made a big difference. So I think technology is definitely playing an important part. GaelStream wasn't available when I was doing my taking those Gaelic classes. So I think that's a big change.
And I think the Gaelic College just recognized the need by having these videos, interviews too. It's going to provide some good background information for
the ones that come later.
Ones that come after us.
Yes, that's right.
And, that can only be a good thing, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you now, what future you see for Gaelic in the years to come?
You know, that's a crystal ball gazing kind of question. I always have a little difficulty with that. When I think about that, what I think is that, you know, I'm a history kind of person, so I when I read things, I talk about, you know, maybe 100 years ago when people were kind of doom and gloom. You know, some of the really, really fine Gaelic speakers could see that there was a decline in the language level and how many people were speaking them, you know, whether it was in Scotland or here. And, you know, you will come across things that were written where they're lamenting that. On the positive side, here we are like at least 100 years later for some of the writers I'm talking about, and it's not gone. You know, it's not gone at all. And so there's something, to my mind, there's something that's keeping it alive, keeping the spark there, which gives me a lot of hope. How it's going to look is anybody's guess. But, you know, I'm always heartened by how many committed people there are. Right. And it's just sort of, it's like I always think of that, I don't know what this will say about me, but with Keith's, you know, India Pale Ale, it's like those who like it a lot. So that's kind of been my experience. People who get onto it, and you know, nothing's going to shake them from it. It's never going to be the majority of the people. I think it'll always be an uphill battle to get some people to understand why we think it's important, or what, you know, how it enriches our lives and our culture. But it's the same as what they say about reading books. I think, you know, the printed book is not gone. A lot of people thought the printed book would be gone. When something is valuable in and of itself, it sustains. You know, somehow it gets sustained. So.
And it's encouraging to hear that there's a mother and child class being started in Rabble.
Oh, I hadn't heard that.
And there's quite an enrollment already.
That's great. So now that's a massive change. There was absolutely nothing like that, you know. So there are encouraging things happening. That's great.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're preparing for the future when these children go to school, hopefully.
Yeah. The other change I might say, you know, this is kind of in answers this question as well, is that there are people in the Nova Scotia Gaelic community who are developing really worthwhile skills. Just sheer length of years being at this, you know, and being exposed to different kinds of workshops and just being educated in general. How I think it's more sophisticated than it used to be. So hopefully that'll bode well for the future. You know, people are getting skills that hopefully will enrich the whole community. So
do you have any advice for Gaelic learners?
Well, you know, I'm one of these people in terms of learning. I think we're all lifelong learners, whether we want to be or not. It's just, particularly in this day of technology. So I think that my view has always been that you can learn something. You're always going to learn something from any kind of experience. So I'm not one of these, you know, this way or that way kind of person. People, when I talk about how to learn Gaelic, I can see benefit to all kinds of things that you do, whether it's learning to read, whether it's listening to audio files on the computer, whether it's just going to something like Colaisde, and even if you don't have the language skills to really participate, just listening. I just think a variety works. We all learn in different ways. We have different aptitudes. We have different things that interest us. So I don't think I have a one size fits all. Just, do your, and I think it's important not to get too stressed about it, not to be too much in a hurry for it, although, that depends on your personality. If you're an A-type personality, you're going to drive at it and you're going to go at it that way. But I think we know a lot more about the affective aspects of learning language, where you have to be at a certain level, you have to be relaxed enough, you have to be have barriers. Your barriers have to be down in order to be able to get the language out of you that you might have in you. So you have to be relaxed. You have to be in a comfortable setting. If you're stressed, or if you think you're going to make a mistake and that stops you from speaking, then it will inhibit you long term. So I think people have to figure out what works for them, around that part of it. I just know from my own experience that I can name the people that to this day, as many mistakes as I will make with my Gaelic, I will speak to them and it feels right and normal, and I enjoy it. And then there's other people that just it's not their fault, it's my fault, but I'm just inhibited. So I think if you can find a person with a good level of Gaelic that you feel really comfortable with, and you can sort of spend as much time as you can, then to me I've seen a difference there. And it's not a straightforward line. It's you're gonna think you're progressing for a while, and then for one reason or another, you slide backwards. What I will say is, I think I can say this now, is that because, as I said earlier, I was away from this really for 2 years. I'm quite pleased to know that my comprehension and my skills are now at some kind of a level that even when I'm away from it for some length of time, it's not gone. I now know that it's a part of me in some way, so what that will tell a learner, I don't know. I think, you get all these little learning stages you have where you think you're not progressing, but, you'll get there. Right. You will get there. It's just, we're not all going to be the same. No. And whatever it is we try to do, but I think, people that have been encouraging are worth their weight in gold. Yeah. That might be a nice way to stop.
Great. Well, Catholic Commode.
Gléidheadh.
Having darkest can be Colaisde Gaelic. Hulawa. Agus a brain. Hulawa. Agus a Gléidheadh Hulawa.
Ními Maíchel.
Gléidheadh. Catholic.
Okay.